to tonight's Theorizing the Present lecture. I'm 3CT's director, Lisa Wadeen, and I'm delighted to be here tonight. 3CT is a collective that began in 2004 with about 7 scholars who wanted to engage in cutting-edge research and to offer programming that was theoretically motivated and politically timely. It's evolved markedly over time with a lot more faculty participation and considerable efforts at outreach to our undergraduate and graduate populations, as well as to interested community members. Currently, in addition to our Theorizing the Present series, we have projects on the corporate university, on capitalism with an emphasis on questions of temporality and empire, on revolutionary disappointment and recalibration, and on counter-authoritarian imaginaries, the latter a Mellon collaborative endeavor headed by Judith Butler. Everything that happens at 3CT is a product of the labor of our faculty fellows, of you who come to our events, and of our remarkable staff. Thanks are owed to Ryan Acholt, our program coordinator, Lucy De Silva, our student assistant, and Anna Cyril Jones, 3CT's associate director, whose creativity and ingenuity make 3CT as successful as it is. Please join me in thanking them first. And now briefly to introduce our speaker. Leah Feldman is an associate professor of comparative literature and theater and performance studies at the University of Chicago. Her research, teaching, and art collaborations focus on the formation and collapse of the Soviet Empire from the vantage point of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Feldman is the author of On the Threshold of Eurasia, Orientalism and Revolutionary Aesthetics in the Caucasus, Cornell University Press, 2018. And she co-edited the special issue, Crisis to Catastrophe, Lineages of the Global New Right with Amr Mufti, Boundary 2, 2023. In addition, she's collaborated with the art collective Slavs and Tatars on the book As Buka Strikes Back, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Buka Strikes Back, and Anti-Colonial ABCs. And she's working on a collaborative curatorial project titled Costumes and Collapse. Feldman's talk tonight draws on her monograph In Progress, Feeling Collapse, which traces the political afterlives of internationalist sentiments following the collapse of the Soviet multinational empire. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Feldman.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for inviting me, for 3CT for inviting me, and thank you, Anna Cyril Jones, also for organizing this talk and for making this incredible poster. It's a really rare and lovely thing to play a home game, and so I'm really grateful to you all for coming out in the snow and for the occasion to dialogue with so many brilliant thinkers who I'm also very, very lucky to call friends. This project is from a book in process, which I'm really excited to work through with you all, and I'll really try to keep it short at 35 minutes so we have time to chat. This book project came out of over 10 years of research and teaching on the global rise of the right. And in this period, I became really obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union alongside other moments like the post-68 moment and post-colonial migration as really central moments in the turning point in the global new rights momentum and in tracing in these moments what we might have missed from this period from around the 90s. So 1989, on the eve of Soviet collapse, Sergei Parajanov returned to a series of filmic collages begun during his imprisonment for crimes of national and homosexual deviation. Amidst these Giocondas in emotional disarray, bodies fragmented and genders reassembled, was the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile. What does she desire? So wondered many, from Gautier to Duchamp and Warhol. But I would like to argue that one of the Mona Lisa's queerest appearances was as the heroine of Nazim Hikmet's 1929 anti-colonial anthem to an international revolution in the East in his Gioconda and Siyao. The love poem begins from her vantage, flipping the Orientalist script. She, a creation of the European masters, object of male desire, product of genius, falls in love with the Chinese revolutionary, Xiao, based on the real organizer, Emile Xiao. She suffers locked in the Louvre, constrained by the smile imposed by her European master, quote, paint on my face cracks out of boredom, forced to keep grinning without letting up. I'm writing on my back, she laments, the sorrows of having a famous smile. She journeys to Shanghai to find her only love, only to watch his execution at the hands of Chiang Kai-shek in a scene that recalls the Shanghai massacre and its attack on the left. The poem draws on the painting's enigmatic expression to emotionally reroute the Communist International's last eastward push before the Sino-Soviet split. Her feigned joy and pain of love lost resolve in the final verse when, after strangling a British officer and being tried by a French military court in Shanghai, she releases a maniacal laugh as she is burned at the stake in a celebration of red victory. Quote, the flames painted Gioconda red. She laughed with a smile that came from her heart. Gioconda burned laughing. Her passion, her sacrifices for the Western canon's annihilation and the ascension of the Red International. Love and internationalism, those heady dreams of the 20th century, would seem foreclosed, as Perezhanov recalled his imprisonment through the Gioconda's many faces. And yet his commitment to fragmentation and reproduction in the collage was one that nonetheless sought to envision queer supranational potentialities. This talk traces the exhaustion and collapse of internationalist feelings, and especially socialist internationalist humanism, which began to break apart with the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and the ends of the Cold War. The collapse of the Soviet Union is often read through a series of posts that celebrated the alleged ends of communist, colonial, and modernity projects of the last 2 centuries, accompanied by the exhaustion of meaning, the end of history, the geopolitical reorganization of the world. In this narrative, the evacuation of meaning that accompanied the end of the Soviet Empire structured post-Soviet life according to a postmodern logic. One might read this as an addendum to Frederick Jameson's claims about late capitalism, postmodernism as the waning of socialist aesthetics. Yet somehow, few could envision the returns of the new right 20 years later. That is, to recognize that the ends of history not only foretold the ends of the Cold War, but the ends of liberalism. This is partly, I argue, because of an all too belated reckoning that the Soviet Union was an empire, a narrative obscured by a left revisionist defense of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and an account of Russian imperialism that was also marked by Russian exceptionalism vis-a-vis Euro-American cultural imperialism. Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the returns of the new right more broadly have undeniably demonstrated what thinkers from Césaire and Adorno and Arendt witnessed a century ago in that terrifying boomerang that returned Europe's empires home with a new fascist face. The only way to confront a global right is to learn from the failures of internationalism and and in particular how the exhaustion of attachments to Soviet multiculturalism and socialist internationalism triggered the authoritarian boomerang with the Soviet Empire's collapse. The Soviet Union was an unusual empire in that it was structured federally as an empire of nations, organized internally by discourses of diversity, anti-racism, and externally by anti-colonial internationalism. a logic that could be summed up by the famous banners celebrating the friendship of the peoples. Friendly feelings peaked during two periods of internationalism, the first being the revolutionary moment of Hikmet's poem when the annexation of the former imperial territories in the Caucasus and Central Asia in the 1920s was retold as the opening of the window to the East in Azerbaijan's capital of Baku in the Congress of the Peoples of the East, creating an internationalist anti-imperial solidarity with India and Iran. The second followed the invasion of Budapest in 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968, and coincided with the Soviet battle for influence in the global South following the Sino-Soviet split. Soviet-sponsored Afro-Asian international youth festivals drew on sport, music, film, art, and literature to promote friendly relations among national delegations of artists, writers, and musicians, as well as international solidarity. And these are images from the World Festival of Youth from 1957, and you see these images of imperial brotherhood and kind of nationalist cosplay here. These scenes thus provided a structure for ordering friendly relations. This slide is from the Writers' Congress in Tashkent in '58, and then some images from the film festivals in Tashkent that ran from the 70s through the 80s. These scenes provided a structure for ordering friendly Soviet multinational and worldly international relations, and cultivate feelings of friendship and belonging, as well as establishing socialist influencers, ambassadors of Soviet culture and lifestyle abroad. As part of the Cultural Cold War, these scenes helped usher in a shift in domestic and international policies that emphasized the consumption of feelings as attachments to a Soviet good life. New media, radio, photography, television, and robust print runs changed the scale of the Second Eastern International, capturing the sounds and visions of socialist internationalism and translating them into digestible Russophone and Soviet cultural terms, such as socialist multiculturalism and socialist world literature. Again, more photos from the Youth Festival. Nikita Khrushchev's revival of the friendship of the peoples expanded socialist humanism from an internal condition of the multi-ethnic nation state to something akin to Hegel's world spirit. Many of the 60s generation of writers and thinkers embraced the thought spirit of socialism with a human face. The proximity of the socialist Soviet East, in turn, Central Asia and the Caucasus, to the global South, a central logic for the marking and unmarking of race and ethnicity onto the bodies of its internal and external others, in turn provided these mediators with the means for translating Soviet Eurasian exceptionalism into a discourse of international anti-racism. The mediation of Soviet internationalism in the cultural sphere was also crucially driven by specific understanding that feelings do things in the world. In the domain of Soviet film, Emma Wittes has argued that the 20s and 30s were marked by a shifting status of bodily sensation and a broad move toward conscious emotion as a determinant of the new Soviet subjectivity. She argues that in the 1920s editions of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, emotion, or emotia, was rooted in the body, while in the 40s and 50s, chuvstva, that is both the emotional and sensory capacity of feeling, was socially determined and value-driven. The third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia was written in the 60s and 70s and further emphasized feeling as a physical and mental process shaped by social, historical development, concluding even that feeling was, quote, the most important condition for the development of personality. Conceptions of feeling developed into forms of external as well as internal social activity and express the social nature of the psyche and the social character of perception. Language in this model establishes meaning not arbitrarily through socially conditioned actions, and in this way, actions in turn shape feelings and their attachments to ideas. Socialist realism as the official method of of Soviet cultural production was in turn praised for its ability to cultivate Soviet feelings. Departing from the dry and lifeless language of agitational films, directors were instead encouraged to stir the spectators' emotions through expressive music and sound. Feeling, thus reconceived in the lead up to the Second International, described the formation of attachments to and movements toward a vision of egalitarian sociality conveyed through the senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, touching. The cultivation of these friendly feelings attuned to optimistic moods was indispensable for the construction of socialist internationalism at festivals, conferences, and sporting events, as well as on the medium of film itself. And it was often imprinted on the bodies of racialized others through alternating registers of visibility and invisibility. An exploration of the activity of socialist internationalist feelings thus exposes how the cultivation of Soviet internationalist good life in the 60s and 70s ruptured into tensions through the increasing visibility of race and ethnicity during the collapse and through the reformation of national borders. My book, Feeling Collapse, takes up a particular set of aesthetic techniques, from collage and montage to tableau vivant in film and video to improvisational performance. In each, I'm interested in how an exploration of the sensuous, tactility, rhythm, improvising with others becomes a mode of being together or even survival when friendly feelings cannot hold. Between the collapse of empire and rise of ethno-nationalism, the book traces how friendly feeling transformed into a liberal violence. Artists drew on mass-mediated images of film, video, and collage, as well as ordered and optimistic moods of the congresses and the festivals, and the multinational literary commons as spectacles of friendly internationalism. The works I discuss in the book take up spectacular forms of imperial multinationalism in the 80s, as well as its echoes in the 2000s in ethno-nationalist imaginaries. And the book seeks to untangle the activity of emotions that propelled Soviet internationalism's good life politics. The project of returning to these conflicted sites that expose the exhaustion of internationalism is, I argue, necessary for not repeating new versions of an old Cold War script that concealed the concordant civilizing missions of Soviet communism and American liberalism. And this project is as central to the moment of feeling Soviet imperial collapse, I argue, as it is to our present one today. Muratova and Perezhanov were products of the Soviet diaspora as ethnic minorities in the republics where they worked. She, born to Romanian and Russian Jewish parents and he, Armenian, raised in Tbilisi, Georgia, both spent most of their careers working for Odessa and Kiev film studios in Ukraine. Both were children of the 6 years Soviet optimism and the second wave of anti-colonial internationalism. But both's work exposed the patriarchal imperial history beneath these friendly feelings. Working with film, Soviet utopian internationalism's most important tool and weapon, they take up the montage as techniques that historically served anti-colonial and anti-racist propaganda and the imperial modernizing agenda. Both filmmakers' work reimagines the montage, specifically its movement toward synthesis and imposition of a concept, to instead turn, like the Gioconda's many faces, to effectively disruptive scenes of conflicted attachments to internationalism leading up to the collapse. Muratova's 1989 Asthenic Syndrome was the last film banned by Soviet authorities, and it attacks the Soviet good life through an evocation of the polymorphous nervous disorder, asthenia, a diagnosis that was interestingly popular during both the formation and collapse of the Soviet Empire. The two main characters, Natasha and Nikolai, suffer from asthenia. which the film's affective dissonance also mirrors. Divided into two parts as a film within a film, the first sequence follows Natasha, a doctor experiencing aggressive and impulsive outbursts following her husband's death, while the second follows schoolteacher Nikolai's struggles with narcolepsy. Natasha suffers extreme exhaustion and faints. Then she laughs, cries, has sex with random people on the streets, eats compulsively, breaks all the glass, and tears out all of the clothes onto the apartment floor. Nikolai, on the other hand, can't stay awake, and yet there's no diegetic distinction made between his waking and his potential dreaming. Dispensing of optimism, hope, ethics, and morality, and their yoking to state and imperial projects, Muratova turns her camera unflinchingly to scenes of suffering and sadistic cruelty against the most precarious, the poor, migrant, sick, elderly, animals, and the collapsing institutional settings that Natasha and Nikolai inhabit, specifically the school and the hospital. The emerging force of illiberal violence, what Nancy Conde terms the failing Soviet civilizing mission, is imprinted onto their characters. The film's dissonant affects and conflicted feelings they produce rather paradoxically become its unifying formal element. Muratova creates montages of affects that at once seem to return to Eisenstein's montage of attractions, but instead of building a new Soviet man, demonstrate the decomposition of Soviet society. Weakness, impotence, and the diminution of vital forces. This asthenic syndrome was in Soviet psychiatric terms understood as a minor form of madness, that is, which could not be legally disciplined through incarceration, but nonetheless marked a form of dysfunctional socialization and the destabilization of affective and behavioral regimes that constituted the relationship between the Soviet subject and the symbolic regimes of the state and its good life politics. The asthenic syndrome dissolves linear narrative and sense. Natasha's scenes of grief rendered in black and white cut to a color scene in a movie theater where Nikolai sleeps through the last shot of Natasha's film as she is lifted up by a crane, rhyming Soviet modernity technologies from heavy industry to filmmaking. Even when we turn to Nikolai's story, the film continues to refuse a coherent narrative arc, frequently turning to dark spaces, alleyways, and doorways, and to repetitive conversations, often between minor and unnamed characters in cluttered and cramped scenes. In the famous opening scene, three babushkas are holding a copy of War and Peace, epitomes of Soviet morality and optimism, and they repeatedly cite a line about learning to read Tolstoy to educate the masses in kindness and intelligence, a theory that would later be exploited for socialist realism's claim to the writer as the engineer of the human soul, generating feeling in comradely activities. While reifying the power of feeling, Muratova eschews moralizing. I am not out to re-educate. I am only aimed to reflect. And I'm going to play you a brief section from this scene to show you what I'm going to talk about is the way that Muratova uses visual collage, but she also uses collage sonically, and this is a really important moment for that. Three women form a desynchronized chorus on loop, a garbled mockery of the intelligentsia, collapsed kulturnost, that exposes the rotten civilizing mission lurking beneath Soviet good life feeling. In another notable scene, and also notably minor, two passing unnamed characters, one white and one black, enter the shot, descending a staircase, as if belated travelers of waning socialist internationalism. A long-haired Soviet intellectual asserts the universal love is an innate human condition and insists on the power of educating the soul. An African student argues that hatred will always exist and hands must be cut. The conversation continues mechanically, reiterating, nurture his soul, cut off his hands. The dialogue is rendered senseless, worn out through repetition. And the white and black bodies of the actors become flattened cliches that in turn expose Soviet racist stereotypes lurking beneath internationalist friendship. The dialogue is interrupted by the material realities of the collapse as a war veteran yells about poor health conditions and lack of public housing, and a crowded queue quite violently fights over a pile of dirty fish carcasses. Exhaustion registers the invisible temporality of the collapse on the body. Through the anonymous bodies of the characters who are not given names, through the veteran and the queue, reminders of economic precarity which interrupt the dialogue. Muratova also often cast non-professional actors in her film. As Irina Sandomierskaya argues, the film contrasts the enunciation of cultured texts such as Tolstoy, by, quote, profane voices, that is, non-professional actors whose vocal ranges haven't been modulated by acting technique, and instead expose linguistic, ethnic class differences, as well as those of imperial center and colonial periphery. The film's sonic polyphony and dissonance, Sandomierskaya continues, generates a glossolia of the Soviet subject, a materialist analysis of glasnost as an audioscape. Muratova, in turn, blurs the line between dialogue, music, and noise, as well as between human, animal, and machine. These, quote, biometrics retrofitted for the doldrums of glasnost, to cite Elena Gorfinkel's memorable phrase, attack the civilizing mission of the Soviet good life through the utopian project of film itself. The actors' bodies, themselves caught in the sway of this moment of political uncertainty, mediate the violence of the collapse, becoming local sites on whose dermis the collapse of the anti-imperial empire become legible, and the skin through which Muratova exposes human frailty and the cracked and rotting collective socialist humanist dream. This is a series of Parajanov's collages that I referenced at the beginning, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But for Parajanov more broadly, collage was a mode of survival over the course of the 5 years he spent incarcerated on charges of homosexuality, pornography, and nationalism. In prison, he produced 800 drawings and collages that gathered remnants from prison food tins to old sugar bags and print media sent by his friends. He writes, "In my isolation, I tried to make everything that surrounded me poetic. Everything that I painted or glued aroused the interests of the supervisors, and they themselves began to draw and tried to glue flowers." Collage provided a mode of survival and arousal that at once rendered sensible the experience of isolation and generated a form of sociality through objects. And he writes later in a letter to his wife Svetlana, "I have expressed my concern for people through things." For Parajanov, his relationship to objects structures his own queer genealogy. He attributes his habit of collecting things to his father, who worked as an antique dealer. Their home was frequently subject to property seizures, and Parajanov recounts swallowing precious items to evade authorities. Quote, "My mom took off her ring and gave it to me to swallow. My whole childhood passed in swallowing my mother's rings and earrings. In my womb lay my family's riches." The jewelry is kept safe at the center of his creative force, a womb from which his later collages and films would be born. Parajanov's collages generate erotic dockings. This is the title of a collage from 1987 in which aesthetic, libidinal, and metaphysical couplings and uncouplings figure around the suspension of time rendered in the innards of a wristwatch. Docking, Stukovka, cites many different types of joinery, from a space station landing, recalling the space race as another dimension of Soviet internationalism, to a slang term for fucking. In collage, Parajanov suggests other dockings, including a spiritual union between Mary and baby Jesus, a fallen angel whose body resembles the bird beside him, and some organic matter, perhaps a mushroom, sprouts, half a dragonfly wing growing out of it. Netting placed over the image in turn docks life and death in this suspended moment of jouissance. At the top of the image are two masked figures whose union echoes the image of erotic and spiritual ecstasy. The bottom's head is surrounded seemingly by a halo. But the bodies are disfigured. One has an amputated arm with a foot in place of a hand. Both figures have one leg each, and both in color and size appear to have been taken from other bodies, presumably photos of sportsmen, perhaps a wrestler and a swimmer or a gymnast. The legs, stretched in athletic tension, in turn echo the hands of a clock. Inasmuch as collage enacts the ruptures and fusions of objects, it also reorganizes the timelines they inhabit, drawing on their historicity, their effective power, our attachments to them, and our modes of being with them in time. Parajanov's dockings thus reorganize our desires. In this longer version of this chapter on Parajanov, I'm thinking with Jonathan Flatley's analysis of the series in Warhol's work as a mode of liking that generates, quote, an effective openness to create correspondences without instrumentalizing them toward a predetermined goal. And following Krim Foucault, Elizabeth Freeman, and others, an expansion of effective and relational possibilities and virtualities. So if we return now to the Mona Lisa series, and specifically The Last Supper, Parajanov's Gioconda at once recalls his incarceration as she animates a fluid gender performance. Parajanov's completed the first work in this series, which you see on the left, Weeping Gioconda from 1977. He completed it in prison and sent it to his friends with the caption, "If I perish in custody, Gioconda will mourn me." The collage, Parajanov claimed, was actually inspired by a tattooed replica of the image on a fellow inmate's back, which contorted as the man moved his limbs, his skin stretching the figure into a smile. His cellmate's body, which is not depicted in the collage itself, nonetheless lies at the foundation of the Gioconda's shifting emotions and ambiguous gendering. Common to this series is the proliferation of images of her hand, profile, and the generous use of reproductions of drapery that form her robe, which Parajanov here deploys to represent bread on the table, facial hair on the far right figure, hair on the head of the far left figure, and to suggest the motion of the hand of the central figure, Christ, presumably a devotional gesture. Overlays of her moving hands echo gestures of dances popular in the Caucasus. Her costume, ornament cut up and reconfigured in the assemblage, forms facial hair that troubles her gendering. Her gestures also evoke a reproduction of another Da Vinci painting, The Last Supper, recalled in the title. Parajanov highlights the muted tones of the velvet fabric drape and her dis and reassembly as key to her many potential becomings. The repetition of the fork, similarly, and once a part of the still life in the image of the Last Supper, and the architecture of the frame encasing the image similarly suggests a doubling through which the Gioconda might exit the frame, like Hikmet's Mona Lisa, who escapes to find her revolutionary beloved. A mode of resistance made sensible through the collage's animation of both art and non-art. The reference to the Last Supper thus lyrically suggests a resurrection not only of Da Vinci's images, but of Parajanov's own series of reassembled Giocondas. The mass image, its disassembly and reassembly as a source for collective world-making is also central for Parajanov, and I won't get into it here, but just to note that Hikmet and Parajanov turned to the Mona Lisa, as did many others, by indexing and reimagining its value in a Western art canon through an attention to the affective dissonance of her mysterious smiles, dislocation, and reproduction. For Parajanov, it is also crucial that the collage and the montage, by extension, are forms of docking, that is, erotic joining. So I'll turn now to Muratova. Muratova deploys a series of collages or collaging techniques and tableaux vivants in this film that recall Parajanov's work. However, more broadly, her shots reveal a preoccupation with collections of objects, which often crowd the frame. I've reproduced some here so you can get a sense of the extent of it. Her attention to objects, thus, more broadly drives a potent critique of socialist humanism. So in the opening sequence, there is a funerary spectacle, the funeral of Natasha's husband, which strikingly here resembles photos of Stalin's funeral, which I've brought up here. And this spectacle of the funeral is in turn broken by shots, by tableaus of faces on the cemetery, a series of shots of the cemetery stones with faces on them. These in turn are then cut to shots of Soviet passport photos, notable for their flattened affect, and here presented sometimes even upside down. Natasha stands in front of them. Both images on the headstones and the passport photos present a kind of face of Soviet multinationalism, though these dead and distorted faces offer a rather morbid and disorderly collective. The montage of collected faces also does not resolve in synthesis, culminating in the Stalinist image, but rather interrupts the spectacle of the public funeral and its evocation of socialist humanism, that is, by announcing Stalin's death as the ends of Soviet authoritarianism. Muratova's inclusion of the photo collage, both visually and effectively flat, engages in a Parajanovian disruption. In a later scene, Nikolai is brought into a game of tableaux vivants, where several young dissidents pose love sculptures. They create these tableaux vivants love sculptures. Muratova describes her intended reference to the old masters, Venus and the Mirror by Titian, reinterpreted by Rubens and Velázquez, and Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which are here in this scene set to Schubert's unfinished symphony. In the last love sculpture, Nikolai enters the room and is lying down. A woman throws herself on Nikolai's rigid, corpse-like body, again recalling Stalin, and proposes marriage. She proposes marriage and takes off her earrings, which are hammer and sickle pens, and puts them on his chest. And then she takes off her top and flashes her breasts. Despite her nudity and her intense, indignant stare, he cannot keep himself awake, and his body is slowly engulfed in ice steam. This love sculpture is in turn disrupted by a silent sequence of tableau, which is presumably Nikolai's dream, and reveals a series of tableaux of men posed in worn and cluttered apartments, all directing their gaze unflinchingly at the spectator. I'm going to show you this sequence. This scene has been read as part of Muratova's commitment to obscenity and pornography that is as integral to her realism and her efforts to estrange the viewer. However, another reading emerges placing these images alongside Parajanov. The boys contrast the earlier sentimental love sculptures, its civilizing mission ornamented by the kitsch wedding narrative and pins. The love sculptures also reproduce bad copies of classical paintings that neither activate Nikolai's desire nor even his waking attention. But from the unknown archives of Nikolai's unconscious, or perhaps the viewers, emerge another series of nudes. These gritty and beautifully queer fragments, like Parajanov's Gioconda, animate the very sites of exhausted internationalism. The youths are no Soviet heroes. They inhabit shots cramped by the clutter and destruction of worn interiors. They stare at the camera with disgust, anger, bemusement, and sorrow. But they also offer the viewer possibilities for a range of other relations and desires. For Parajanov, collage brings the violence of his imprisonment to the surface, from his fellow inmate's body to its docking in Gioconda's Last Supper. Muratova exposes the rotting core of socialist internationalism by rendering sensible the dissonant visual, sonic, and affective texture of film on the bodies of the actors whose labor generated it. Both foreshadow the collapse of internationalist feelings, those neatly ordered collectives that were once mediated in the glossy print images and films of congresses, festivals, and internationalist journals. However, Parajanov and Muratova's dockings offer more riotous internationalist couplings that return us to the maniacal laughter of Hikmet's Gioconda as she burns for love and revolution. The project of feeling collapse is not to dwell in the violence of internationalism's failures, though they certainly haunt our present, but to locate in its effective power, as in Parajanov and Muratova's dockings, the capacity to desire otherwise and imagine new relations and horizons of belonging. That's it. Okay. Yeah, I'd love if you have questions or comments. I'd love to think with you on this material.
You were talking about
You need to wait for the mic, please.
yeah, okay. Muratova's playing with the old masters in these collages.
Yeah.
But I want to know if there is a source for the three babushkas.
Yes. I mean, what do you mean by a source?
Well, my reason for asking is probably a bit, off in the margins. I recently saw a rather epic play by Ariane Mnouchkine in Théâtre du Soleil, rather more positive, although critical account of the Russian Revolution. And she has, at intervals, three babushkas commenting on the action. So I just wanted to know whether there was a cinematic or some other literary source in the sort of optimistic Soviet canon of these three babushkas that she appears to be satirizing.
As far as the visual imagery, I don't know of one in particular, but there's a lot of cliches at work here, yeah. And like the fact that they are holding hands, but then they're in this dissonant chorus. But actually, this citation which they are reading about, the importance of Tolstoy, was also from Muratova's own diary. So she is also, turning the camera against herself and mocking herself. This is like a mockery of the intelligentsia and this idea of the kind of civilizing mission, but she is also mocking directly her own words. But as far as the visual imagery,
Photography of three babushkas.
I mean, it's also the triad, or, it's like biblical, but extends to Soviet reproductions, of course. But yeah, but the specific imagery, I don't know. Yes? Oh, sorry.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I noticed that you mentioned a lot of exquisite visual examples of the internationalism, but I also noticed that at the very beginning you provided a linguistic reference about the the Soviet way to frame those kind of collective and individual tension, the tension between the collective and the individual. You mentioned the word emosia and other kind of words. So I'm wondering, do you think there's kind of linguistic new points that can be served as an alternative to frame the tension between the individual and the collective, just as maybe Lauren Belen would do from her affect theory, that kind of tension. So do you think there's kind of the cultural specificity embedded in linguistics to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this, I mean, I had to cut this section short, but in the longer version of it, I'm thinking with activity theory in a specific moment of Soviet psychology and linguistic psychology. Thinkers such as Vygotsky, his students Leontiev and Luria, who build on him and kind of, and later Vygotsky himself moves away from affect as being situated only in the body to being established as a kind of more a form of social relations. There's other figures like Yevod Ilyenkov who are really important, who's like a Spinozist, who's really interested in thinking about locating emotion in the body, but also in a kind of sociality. So it's not quite Spinozan in that sense, but it's more located in a sort of activity and sociality. But yeah, there's a long history of this in looking at psychology and linguistics, and specifically Marxist approaches to psychoanalysis that are emerging from the 30s through the 50s. Yeah, thank you for the question.
So, Kira Muratova, she worked in Odessa.
Yes.
And how ironic is this, that one of the best Soviet Russian directors, now Odessa bombed by Russia, that it looked like they want to kill the memory of her, partially, memory of her, and go there like culture to nothing. And so how would you interpret this in real time, that kind of Russians, they kill retrospectively, but still Russian art?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think this is a perfect example of what the collapse of multinationalism produced. And kind of my intention here is to highlight the fact that multinationalism formed as a mode of sustaining empire, but also that its collapse resulted in the force of authoritarian violence, exactly in the way that you were talking about, and the constriction and the creation of even more monolingual and monologic culture. Thank you. Yes.
Dramatic build-up to the question. This is a really rich talk. Thank you so much. And I have a question about Muratova, and I think the really fantastic sequences that you showed us. The thing that is always said about this film is that it's the film about the collapse of the Soviet Union. But one thing that I always grapple with when thinking about it is that the case can be made that, at least in the context of its production, that was world historically way less clear in the moment than it is now. And one thing that really struck me about the segments that you showed, and you use this language as well, is that maybe unlike montage, I think what's really interesting, Muratova, here is the series. And, you know, particularly in these shots, but also in the passport photos and the collections of objects, it seems to me that the spectator here is asked not necessarily to arrange contradictions in a kind of classic montage approach, but instead to grapple with the endless reproduction of the system itself. And I love the evocative language of collapse that is applied to this, but it also seems like one of the problems with her world here is that it's actually massive and keeps growing and is overwhelming, but it keeps reproducing mediocrity. So like, I wonder if that is something that comes into play in the collapse itself, or if that feeling of just kind of like meh that everybody is feeling is less in response to a kind of lacquer collapse and more to just actually endless growth.
That's a great question. And I agree with you definitely that the series, I mean, I think that's why it's important to me to put her in dialogue with Parajanov, because I think otherwise, you know, the importance of the tableau doesn't, and the series of tableaus doesn't become as starkly realized as you see it here. And also this obsession with objects and clutter. You know, the new version of the film, I think, is like really hard to watch. This is the remastered version, and it's really hard to watch because there's so much stuff. I mean, you thought there was already so much stuff in the film, and now you're like, whoa, my God, it's like visually exhausting. But I guess, yeah, the reproduction is really, that tension between collapse and reproduction is really interesting. And I think I'm trying to think it through exhaustion in a certain sense, because it's because of the durational dimension of it. Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you so much for your really fascinating talk. Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, my apologies. So we've kind of seen in the collapse of various supranational projects, I'm specifically thinking of especially in Yugoslavia and the Balkans, that memory and grievance played a really crucial role in the sort of formation of these new ethno-nationalist identities. And I'm really curious if in these works that you explore, like how memory is kind of both informing the form of montage or of kind of collage and also the content of the work.
Thank you for this. I mean, I think of repeated images and recurrent images that have become iconic. For Muratova, she's interested in images that have become so cliche that they are worn out, that they've been completely evacuated of meaning. But I think you know, there are other video art pieces that I'm thinking with in the book that are interested in, you know, for example, in the chapter that I'm writing on Rustam Halfan, Kazakh video artist. I'm interested in how he is using this figure of the nomad. And I don't know that this is so much a memory image, so much as it is like an icon. So maybe the answer to your question is that I think one of the things about one of the things I'm looking at is how things get exhausted, how images actually get exhausted, and there's not a real investment in memory here. So yeah, thank you for helping me think through that.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I have two questions, and it may have to do with my unfamiliarity with this wonderful work you've brought to our collective attention. The first one is, in response to questions, you have mentioned satire, but there's very little theorization in your talk about the humor embedded in so many of these works, whether it's satire or irony or whatever is going on. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the work that these comedic forms might be doing here. And the second question is about the final shot here we see. It's maybe not the final shot of the film, but I see no internationalism here. So I'm trying to figure out where you're reading internationalism into this. I mean, there's the open window, so it's not completely claustrophobic. We have the door too, but internationalism strikes me as a kind of retrospective or a stretched reading. So could you say more about what about the collapse of internationalism is made evident in this?
Yeah, thank you. So humor, this is a really good question, and I think, in Parajanov there's a lot of humor, but also in Muratova, because, and I think one of the things I was struggling with when I was preparing the talk is that I would love to just show so many clips, because the humor transpires durationally. That is to say, they're not sight gags, but the humor arises out of this repetition. The images become funny because they become meaningless, because they become worn out. So it's sort of hard to show the humor, but it is true that that this is also a really important tactic, actually, that Muratova is using. And I would say that Parajanov's humor comes from juxtaposition, from these dockings. And the play with them as collage and erotic dockings. And the different kinds of objects that come into the fray. Even Muratova, when I was preparing some of the slides, you have to look into these scenes. There's this collection of objects, and like Parajanov, she also does this, where she has these scenes that are so cluttered, but then if you look into them multiple times, you see these very odd juxtaposition. So it's through juxtaposition and repetition that humor emerges. But that's a really important thing to remember. As far as internationalism in this scene, I think this series of repetitions of faces is kind of trying to generate a kind of Soviet multinationalism, or trying to evoke it. Both the sonic polyphony of the film. Again, the registers of vocal ranges that come through the untrained actors, but also the overlapping of the track that you hear here, and similarly, visually, through this series of tableaus, you have this reiteration of the kind of passport photo face. So I feel, to me, this end recalls also this passport face, where you have this kind of photos of the Soviet multinational citizen, but here we have a different kind of portrait. So I feel that this film is playing with, from the opening, right, we have the funeral, which is reflected in the headstones, which is reflected in the passport photos, and there's so many series of still portraits that occur in the film. So I think that for me, the image of multinationalism is through the series of the passport photo that gets reiterated.
Yeah, thank you. This is a follow-up on Lisa's question. So when you talk about the feeling of the exhaustion of internationalism, I can see, so you talked a little bit about the exhaustion of images of the good life, or feelings of the collapse of images of the good life. There's now what you're saying about multinationalism, or multiculturalism also was something that you brought up. I feel like another way to think about internationalism, which you gestured to briefly with Global South kind of anti-colonial movements, is solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a sense that there's an exhaustion of a sense of solidarity as well? And I think this is interesting to me, because in a way, when you talk about the rise of the new right, partly you're also talking about pressures on precisely those three ideas, right? The good life, multiculturalism, solidarity. So, and if it is about solidarity, and if it's transnational solidarity, right? What does it mean for that to be exhausted? What does that feel like?
That's a great question. I think the example I used here was of of kind of multinational solidarity is this interlude between these two characters. It's like, and again, the characters are unnamed. It's a minor scene, but like the objects Muratova is really playing with these clusters of minor scenes, and this is like, this scene plays out so many cliches of Soviet solidarity and internationalism, yeah, I mean, but what was the second part of your question? What does it mean to exhaust that? Yeah, I mean, I think that, what does it feel like? I mean, I think what it means to exhaust this is, it means the ends of liberalism. It means the rise of a liberal politics. I mean, it is like the ambivalence of this collapse of multinationalism, which was on the one hand a means of unifying empire, but which also sustained liberalism in the same way that it did, I think, in the US. Such as to say that with its collapse, you see the rise of racial and ethnic tensions that emerge around the formation of nation states. So I think it feels like a liberal violence. And I think Muratova is really, that's what I mean, so much of this film is really hard to watch. There's so much violence, really. And, but I think that's what makes her important to watch in this moment. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether it's a situation of there's a noble Soviet internationalist utopian ideal, and then unfortunately it collapsed, or is it the case that it was a fraud from the beginning? And that would be the Orwell view, that war is peace, truth is lie, and so on and so forth. And the same is said about liberalism, that liberalism is an imposture. But if that's the message, then it's also the case that ethno-nationalists are claiming that like the rule of law, liberalism, all of that is a fraud or a delusion. So like Carl Schmitt is full of these ideas. So one could take images or narratives very much like this as actually being pro-ethno-nationalist, that this is the reality. And I'm aware that there's a Soviet film from the 1930s made in Ukraine that was deliberately subverting this. It has a title something like An Ideal Man, but the makers of the film made it so that it would have this, reveal that we don't believe this bullshit we're saying. But I wonder where exactly these are coming from. Is it, what is it?
I mean, I could say that, I think some of that ambiguity is really, is one of the reasons that I think Muratova is hard to think with, because she really commits solidly to resisting moralizing, and that is what leads to this she presents us with scenes to look at, and she does not tell us how to look at them. And I think, this is kind of creates some of the force maybe of that ambiguity that you're talking about, if I understood correctly.
Thank you for this talk. I have nothing at all intelligent to say about the archival material you present here, but I did have a question about the periodization of the relationship between collapse and the rise of the new right, but also, the sort of internationalist question. So the way you present it here, and maybe this is just a Soviet-specific story that you take yourself to be telling, that you get the collapse of communism and then you get the rise of the new right. But, there's a pretty prominent new left argument that actually the rise of the new right, the collapse of internationalism, has happened in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to understand, does the collapse of the Soviet Union collapse our horizons, or does the Soviet Union collapse because the horizon had already fallen away? That there is essentially, that the exhaustion comes from somewhere else, and then the question is, where is the exhaustion coming from, and how is this alternative possibility available if we haven't ever renovated a kind of vocabulary for thinking about alternative futures that would allow for a re-enlivening of possibility in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with your latter point that this exhaustion was already happening, and I completely agree that the new right, especially the French new right, emerges in the, after the first waves of post-colonial migration in the 60s, late 60s, and actually the Nouvelle Droite was incubated the Russian right. So Russian right thinkers like Alexander Dugin spent time with the French Nouvelle Droite, and really, so there's a really direct connection there. But I also think the similar thing that happens in the collapse in the Soviet Union is also a series of post-colonial migration internal to the former Soviet empire, so which mirrors what is happening in Europe in the 60s and 70s. So it is to rather say that it's absolutely already there, but it's just another wind in the rubber band that just breaks. Did that answer your question?
Hey, thanks, Leah. That was fantastic, I feel like I just learned a lot, and I really like the way you opened up a space for us to think about aesthetic form and this sort of epical historical shift. And so I've been thinking about the relationship that you trace out between collapse on the one hand, and then these forms, which seem to be a really interesting combination of collage and montage on the one hand, but that take this kind of serial form based on some kind of similarity or sort of serial principle. And so one question is there something about that form which is particularly fitting for representing the feeling of collapse or the experience of collapse? And a kind of, supplemental element of that question is, what is it can we say more about what it is that collapsed, or more nearly about what element of that collapse is being felt in these images? So Susan Buck-Morss talks about that the collapse is it's the end of these sort of dream worlds of mass utopia, both in East and West. And so what is that? I mean, clearly you're talking about the end of internationalism, and that makes a lot of sense there. So anyway, I'm just sort of inviting you to reflect on that further. And I want to ask you about the wallpaper in those final images, because it seems like that's a crucial. Was that room chosen precisely because of that kind of spectacular? What do we guess? Like 70s Soviet wallpaper?
Totally.
Are we thinking? And it's like there's like a pattern maybe that's almost like a. Looks like a medal or something, like a round thing with something like hanging off of it, and it reminded me of Warhol made all these wallpapers from images, cows, and I think he might have even done a Mona Lisa one at some point. But the play with foreground and background here, are sort of making the background sort of leap to the front in a way, seems really interesting there. And just I'm just trying to think: is there something about collapse in there as well? So anyway, that's a long rambling question, but I found it really productive and helpful talk. So thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a really great question, and I love that you asked me about the wallpaper, because I think these are really related. So, on the mediums, I think both Muratova and Parajanov are interested in a couple of things with the tableau vivant and the collage. One is like the thingness of everything, which is both its reduction to an object, but also the animation of objects, as Parajanov talks about, is like the sociality with things, and this being a critique of socialist humanism, because like the human can only go so far, and so we have to form relations with objects. And the flatness of it the kind of temporal drag that's created through the tableau vivant. I think also, there's just, I was thinking about this wallpaper also because of the green. So about the patterns, I don't know, and this is a really interesting question because of course the reproduction of all these patterns then crowds the frame even more. But also there's this green color, and the green color was leftover, as I understand, leftover World War II paint was green. And so this is why all the schools and hospitals and everything are painted this green. But the green is also like, it's, indestructible. I mean, you can just rub dirt on it and it just nothing sticks to it. So I don't know, the wallpaper recalls a kind of, it's like both kitsch and it's of this 70s moment, but it also recalls that green. Also I think maybe this is getting back to your question too, Lisa, is like this can be any apartment. This can be any apartment. It's in a sort of state of disrepair, but it's everyone's apartment in a certain sense, also. Yeah.
Thank you, Liz, so much for very thought-provoking paper. I loved it. I have a question that kind of follows up on Jonathan's question about aesthetic form. I've been thinking about the aesthetics of these two artworks, and it made me think that actually they're using montage for different purposes. I felt, and I just want to see what you think about that. It made me think that Muradova's use of montage is deconstructive. She is rejecting and subverting socialist realist aesthetics, and as well as Soviet love of old masters and beauty. Meanwhile, actually, I feel that what Parajanov is doing with his montage is actually recuperative, and it's like you said, it's resurrection.
Yeah.
It's re-aestheticization of something, and I was thinking that. What do you think about the place of the avant-garde, talking about another internationalist movement? Because, it seems to me that he is using Mona Lisa not only because Soviets loved old masters, but also he's using Mona Lisa because the avant-garde rejected Mona Lisa, right? And I'm thinking about Duchamp's Mona Lisa with the cigarette. I'm thinking, of course, about Malevich's Mona Lisa, and, being eclipsed by the black square. And here, actually, what he's doing is he's bringing Mona Lisa back through the black of the, Malevich's black square and returning her in in proliferated, serial numbers in order to kind of bring back this aesthetic beauty and kind of actually resist collapse, maybe. So I was just thinking what you think about that.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I sort of do agree with you. I mean, I wanted to think through Muratova with you all because this is going to be hopefully at some version the introduction to the book, but I have the Parajanov is from another chapter, and I think even in his, I look at the collages in relation to his films, and I think the films are kind of suture all of these internationalist trajectories. I mean, fantastically so. They play on the fairy tale and the poem to put together this incredible swath of space-time, and he's always mixing, forms of ornamentation and dress, and so there is this kind of, I think this Stukovka is this kind of life-generating sort of feature. Docking has a kind of generative feature and generative toward the collective. I mean, and it's interesting to think of those in relief, like what you mentioned, the sort of evocation of the avant-garde interest in Mona Lisa, whereas Muratova seems to just mock this portrait of the love sculptures, or like the intellectuals playing at love sculptures. Although I don't know, she says that she puts it to Schubert. In an interview, she says she puts it to Schubert so that, people wouldn't think that it's like she's making a moral judgment on them. But certainly it's sort of bad art, right? Thank you.
So I'm wondering if you can say anything about the cuts that censors forced her to make to the film before it could be released, and whether you've seen it both in its censored and uncensored versions, and what your thoughts are on the differences. And I also just want to add a quick comment that came up in the discussion earlier about the idea of Russian bombing to erase history. That seems a little topsy-turvy. I mean, in Ukraine, there was a law passed in 2015, a decommunization law that led to a whole bunch of things, including renaming the People's Friendship Arch in Kiev as the Ukrainian People's Friendship Arch, and removing all sorts of statues. So it's certainly not one-sided anyway.
So on the question of censorship, is a really interesting question. In fact, it was not the nudity. None of this caused censorship. It was a very long scene of profanity. There's a scene in a school bus at the end where a character, again unnamed, enters the scene. She's like a very well-dressed kind of Soviet middle-aged lady, and she just like takes down the viewer, basically. It's just like a obscene cussing sequence, and that it was censored for that. I don't think there's a version that, it was shelved for 9 months or whatever, but it appeared in Berlin and won the Silver Bear during that time. So if you look up old photos of it, you'll see the German cover. But it was censored for the profanity, not for the nudity. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I feel like I learned a lot. I have like a half-formed question, and it's somewhat basic, but maybe it's good sometimes to ask basic questions. Please. So I was taken with the idea of like exhaustion, and your framing of it through feeling specifically, and not affect, or maybe libidinal investment, or desire, etc. So I was wondering why that is, and then I, kept on thinking about question of exhaustion in my own project. I'm thinking about the kind of like dissipation or dissolution of energies, libidinal, political, material, right? So like a similar form of collapse, but maybe coming at it like through a different segue. And so, if we carry on this like line of thought, the kind of exhaustion or dissolution of energy should lead to a kind of, death or deathliness. And yet, we see the many afterlives of such exhaustion, right? That's then re-energized and resurrected somehow, right? Which you frame as like liberal violence. And so then I was thinking, specifically about your line, like friendly feeling was transformed into libidinal. Oh, that's a fun slip. Liberal violence. Yeah. But I'm wondering if like this is where the half-formed question is.
Illiberal violence, yeah.
Yeah, liberal violence. So then I'm wondering how you're kind of like conceptualizing the relationship maybe dialectically between, this transformation, right? Like the feeling being transformed into violence. And I'm also thinking about what we're seeing now is like, it's also a very multi-ethnic form of fascism, right? Specifically within the context of invasion of Ukraine. So we're seeing a new kind of, right, like internationalist fascism, so to say, right? Which is super interesting, I think. And there's this kind of like libidinal investment in violence, right? Always. So I guess like, whether or not anything I've said is like making you think of anything else. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. There's a lot of richness there. I would say just, yeah, exhaustion is interesting to me, I think, as, and this film specifically as a study of exhaustion, as a mode of understanding a moment that was effectively dissonant, that is the collapse of socialist feelings. So when this good feeling collapses, these friendly feelings collapse, what do you have? And I think Muratova is like making this film before, but you can see the traces of violence erupting. I mean, really the bodies of the actors, the sound, the range of emotions is quite violent. There's just like, if you listen to a conversation, they're completely erratic, and emotions have no relationship to the script or dialogue at some points. So there's this like dissonance between how bodies are working and how feelings are working. And I think Muratova is just thinking about this in this moment before it becomes legible. And yeah, I really like how you mentioned this kind of the internationalism of the right, because this is one of the things that really came to the fore for me, was like how the rise of the global right was facilitated really by a conception of internationalism and reacting against, I think, this form of liberal internationalism that was collapsing, from the long period from the 70s really through the end of the 80s and 90s.
We have time for one more question here, and then please join us for some refreshments in the back.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, when you were talking about Parajanov's like love for things and objects, I remembered Rodchenko's idea of like things as friends, like objects as friends and companions. And I was thinking that in Parajanov's and Muratova's like universe, that abundance of things becomes also friendly in a way that like things as companions help to live through that exhaustion and through the feeling of collapse, through some kind of intimate relationship with all of those objects that are so like over-present in Parajanov's work and in Muratova's. And I was thinking, like, do you think there are like remains of any of those things that can be like companions and like helpers of some sorts in the space of now? Because now it seems like I don't know, the thing that came to my mind was it's like Ukrainian film 200 meters to Andriivka, where like they're trying to get to like the Ukrainian like little battalion or whatever, like a couple of guys trying to conquer the already destroyed village or place by Russians, and then at the end is just like desolation and like all burned landscape, and like Ukrainian flag is the only like remaining thing in that like universe of post-Soviet destroyed space. And then like in Russia too, with like this war being, I don't know, I was also thinking about the meat processors that Russian government gave to like moms of dead like Russian soldiers, I think. Like, is there a space like besides from the like flags and the meat processors for like some kind of things in the contemporary post-Soviet space that could like help understand what's happening? Like, are there any images in like the art that is being created now?
Thank you for this question. Yeah, on Rodchenko and this kind of like comradely relations with objects, definitely. And I think Christina Kayer's book was really helpful for me for thinking through that. But I think, yeah, this question of today is really interesting. I mean, like if you notice, kind of there's a return to thinking about sort of flawed aesthetics with AI, like cameras with like the Leica has a kind of distorted lens that distorts the images, and thinking about the return of the popularity of that as a distorted image that's marked by its thingness, that's marked by its use of film. But in terms of objects, I have to think about it. It's a really, it's an interesting question, but yeah, I think also, you know, even the new right turns to objects. There was this like lifestyle blogger, trad wife lifestyle blogger, who I was looking at for a period of time, and she was like obsessed with these like worn out Tolstoy volumes, you know, and the materiality of them. So I think it's also, this interest in things is also not, you know, does not bespeak its politics, but it's about establishing a kind of historicity, you know, that both this kind of lifestyle turn in the right do as much as these images do now. But in terms of thinking about, the contemporary, there is this, the Vorobyovs are a Kazakh collective who produce installation and media art, and they also have a series that I was going to show of these passport photos, these like distorted passport photos, and they're doing all of these kind of things with the passport photos, both as these objects, you know, the old passport photos coming from these particular machines, but also distorting them and thinking about the kind of distorted affects that come from making collages out of them. So that period, that one is from 2010. Victor and Yelena Vorobyov. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very, very much.